numerous times that the earth was created a full-grown earth. It wasn't something that God had to take millions of years in order to bring it into being. And remember, we're dealing with how the earth was furnished for the maintenance and for the support of man. So as we looked last week, the first half day of day 3, not only were rocks and minerals formed, but so had a blanket of fertile soil been prepared by God upon the earth. God had prepared that so that it would sustain vegetation. And vegetation is what we will be looking at this morning and dealing with in the latter part of that third day. But I want to begin with something else just momentarily. You remember last week that I mentioned to you an Ernst Mayr, a biologist, died about 15 years ago, 100 years of age. And he speaks of evolution as a fact. He says it doesn't need to be proven, it's a fact. Just explain it. How did it happen? How could it happen? I asked the same question, how could it happen? Not in quite the same way that he does. How could it happen? He wrote a book, What Evolution Is. A book. I would like to suggest to you and read for you this morning what is meant by evolution by Byron Nelson. This is in a book that is entitled After Its Kind. It is an excellent book. It was written in 1927. I have the 1958 edition of it, but it is excellent in its explanations of what God has done. But this is what he says concerning evolution. Evolution, as the word is used in the widespread discussion of the present day, denotes a process which has taken place entirely naturally without the miraculous intervention of any divine being, by which from out of a single remote ancestor living in the waters of some distant sea have come all the living things in the world today. It is a natural process which, if it ever took place, would enable all birds, fish, reptiles, mammals, apes, and men to trace their ancestry back from all directions to a speck of protoplasm that somehow came into existence hundreds of millions of years ago. Evolution means a process by which man must trace his ancestry back to some ape form, then to some quadruped, thence to some reptile, thence to some amphibian, thence to some fish, thence to an invertebrate, thence to some single-celled creature that lived in the slime of the sea. If evolution is a fact, then species have never been fixed and are not so now, but have been continually drifting over from one form into another since world history began. This is the commonly accepted meaning of the term, and one which will be given in the ensuing discussion, and he goes on to discuss some things in connection with that. Isn't it delightful to look into God's Word and to see how He has made present provision here in Genesis chapter 1? Look with me again at those verses 11 through 13. And God said, "Let the earth bring forth grass, the herb yielding seed, and the fruit tree yielding fruit after his kind, whose seed is in itself upon the earth." And it was so. And the earth brought forth grass, and the herb yielding seed after his kind, and the tree yielding fruit, whose seed was in itself after his kind. And God saw that it was good. And the evening and the morning were the third day. A present provision was made by God for the immediate products of the earth to be available, because remember, creation took place in a 6-day period, And God is going to create man. He is going to create animal life. And he is preparing so that it can be sustained upon the earth. That's a present provision. God knows what he's creating, and he knows what the physical needs of that creation are, and he provides. But it's provision likewise for time to come. It's not simply that God is providing for the animals he will create in those days of creation. It's not simply for the man and woman he will create during those days of creation. It is provision for time to come. Because every one having its seed in itself will produce after its kind. So God has given the vegetation at this point for those who will populate the earth at that point in time, but he is providing for the future as well. You and I are the recipients of that. Look around. Consider the greenness of the earth. Consider the beauty of what God has given. Consider the things that are edible, that we enjoy so much, even if you're not much of a vegetable eater. They're there. They're provided for us. God did this so that the continuance of man upon earth would provide him with food that would be brought forth out of the earth for his use and for his benefit. You and I are the recipients of that. God brought vegetation into existence. That really is what verse 11 is telling us when it says, "And God said, let the earth bring forth grass, herb, and trees yielding fruit." There is a provision that God is making. And this work attaches itself quite naturally to the preceding work, because dry land had been formed. Remember, the earth was without form and void, and God intervened, and he brought into existence, brought up from the depths, those mountains and the plains and all the areas, drew the waters together into one place, that is, into the areas that had been prepared for them. And now, with that land formed, at once God commands the earth to bring forth vegetation. Notice, God's command was given to the earth to bring it forth. It's significant. These plants were made not as seeds, but as full-grown plants whose seed was in themselves. Adam was created as a full-grown man. He was not brought forth as a baby that needed to grow. These plants were not brought forth from the earth as those things that needed now to go through the process of growing and growing and growing until they could provide for the needs of mankind. So they're made not as seeds, but full-grown plants. And the fact that the earth is the mediate agent in this instance does nothing to change the fact that God was at work. God was the one who commanded. God was the one who said to the earth, bring forth this vegetation. The work is of neither a higher or lower character than the other works of God. When we read Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And we think of the majesty of that and the amazement of that God could do that very thing. But this is not a lower character of work that God has done when he simply says to the earth, bring forth vegetation, bring forth the grass, bring forth the herbs, bring forth that which grows upon the trees. The evolutionist has no final answer as to which came first, the chicken or the egg. There are varying opinions among evolutionists as to what took place and how it came into being and how we got to be here. Verse 11 answers that in principle. For it says, God said, let the earth bring forth grass, the herb yielding seed, and the fruit tree yielding fruit, and after his kind, whose seed is in itself upon the earth, and it was so. God didn't command the seed to bring forth, he commanded the earth to bring forth vegetation. It's a careful notation that we need to make in the passage that is before us. And the vegetation itself was then to produce seed that would germinate more vegetation. So there's nothing here that indicates the prior creation of seed. God has commanded the earth, the soil, to bring forth, and from that bringing forth, now in the process of time, there will be seed and there will be an advancement of this vegetation. You see, the reality is, in answer to the question, which came first, the chicken or the egg, the parent always exists before the offspring. Always. That's true today, is it not? You're not here today because you came before your parents. You're here today because of your parents, because they brought forth. They provide for you. And God, in his great wisdom in creation, is seen in that he had already prepared some things for this very moment of the bringing forth of vegetation. He had prepared light. He had prepared atmosphere. He had prepared soil. He had prepared water. No need for millions of years to pass to somehow bring into existence all these things. God had prepared for what he was going to do. All of those were necessary for the life of vegetation. It could not live without what God had provided, which in turn would be necessary to the life of living creatures that were yet to be created. You see how carefully God has planned. You see how clearly God has worked in this. How do the things produced by the earth differ from one another? Did you notice that there are 3 classifications that God gave to us? 3 classifications of vegetation, which God summoned into existence on the 3rd day of creation, verse 12. And I believe these 3 cover all vegetation, which was extremely important to man. Now, there are many variations that come underneath the terms that God has used here to tell us about what he brought forth from the earth, or had and commanded the earth to bring forth. But they cover all of vegetation. Man was created on the 6th day. You remember what God told Adam in Genesis chapter 1, verse 29? And God said, behold, I have given you every herb bearing seed, and bearing seed which is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree in the which is the fruit of a tree yielding seed, to you it shall be for meat. It's going to be to you for food. Adam, I am providing for you. I have already provided for you. And verse 30 goes on to say, and to every beast of the earth, and to every fowl of the air, and to everything that creepeth upon the earth, wherein there is life, I have given every green herb for meat, for food, and it was so. Now, notice those 3 specifications of vegetation. Grass. That's intended to include all the spreading, ground-covering vegetation. It represents a Hebrew word whose root signifies to be damp. D-A-M-P. To be damp. Whatever grows in well-watered spots will be a fresh green. It may be said to include such things as mosses and other plants that are designed with a very special purpose of carpeting the earth, as well as providing for some creatures, because it would provide food for the lower creatures that were to be created later. I can remember hiking along East Rosebud River in Montana, the foot of the Beartooth Mountains, and remembering the many places where the moss and the lichen and fungi covered the various rocks of the earth. Ricketts Glen, how many of you have been to Ricketts Glen? You know what I'm talking about when you think of that green that is around because of the dampness of the ground and the earth and the waters that are there providing for it. In the Preacher's Bible commentary, this is what they note concerning this word grass. The Hebrew word is of course underlying that. Note that the chief characteristic of this classification is that it does not bear seed. The other two classifications do. The root meaning of the Hebrew word deshe means green or damp. This would include all damp and all green plants that carpet and hug the earth. It would include mosses, lichens, algae, fungi, ferns, plants which reproduce by spores, cryptogamous plants, plants which carpet and lie immediately upon or under the surface of the earth. And then notice that he mentions herbs. The earth is going to bring forth herbs, and that includes all bushes and shrubs. It's a singular collective noun. It's also translated herbage. It's a characteristic mark of being something that seeds seed or yields seed. Grasses do, when they are allowed to grow and grow and grow, yield seed, but there's specific mention made here apparently referring to something like seed-bearing pods, which makes seeds more prominent as a separate feature. So God is identifying these various things that he is going to bring forth from the earth. And according to scriptural usage, man eats herbs, and so do cattle. Genesis 1:29, we read already. I've given it to you, everything that is bearing seed, which is upon the face of all the earth. In Genesis 3, verse 18, thorns also and thistles shall it bring forth to thee, and thou shalt eat the herb of the field. Deuteronomy 11:15, and I will send grass, it's actually this second word, herbs, in thy fields for thy cattle, that thou mayest eat and be full. So we have a broad class name here that includes such things as vegetables, or at least generally speaking, everything between grass and trees, and without a doubt, the various grains that God has provided for man. So the seed is emphasized because the seed of the plants is in the form of grain and pods, and it's something that would be very important to man after he was created. You see how carefully God is preparing for you, for me, not only for Adam and Eve, but for us still upon this earth. Preacher's commentary says herbs or plants which yield seed. This includes all seed-bearing plants such as grains, vegetables, bushes, shrubs, flowers, weeds, grass, all plant life between the ground-hugging plants and the towering trees. And then notice, thirdly, that God says that he is going to see and bring forth from the earth trees. Trees. That includes all large woody plants, including fruit-bearing trees. It's a singular collective that must include both trees that bear fruit as well as those that yield nuts and cones, and surely all bushes yielding berries. And so the expression translated literally is tree of fruit. God has provided in that way. And then there are two other marks that are appended to this class. Notice it bears fruit after their kind. They will bear fruit after their kind. That's a peculiar and a definite limitation. It is given with a specific purpose in mind. Nature itself here is seen to have definite limitations fixed, which appear as constant laws or as insurmountable barriers. God says it will yield after its kind. They're still searching for the missing link. The interesting thing is the missing link is still missing. They continue to try to find a crossing over so that there is a new species of man or animal or plant or whatever it might be that is produced. I want you to listen to what Byron Nelson says now in his book, After Its Kind, and he entitles this The First Word of Evolution, or On Evolution. A correct understanding of what the Bible teaches regarding the origin of plants and animals is an exceedingly vital matter for those who would have an intelligent understanding of the doctrine of special creation. As will be seen in a later chapter, the most crude misconceptions of special creation prevail among evolutionists and are attributed by them to those who uphold the creation theory. In chapter 1 of Genesis, we read, "And God said, let the earth put forth grass, the herb yielding seed, and the fruit tree yielding fruit after its kind, wherein is the seed thereof upon the earth. And it was so. And the earth brought forth grass and herb yielding seed, and the fruit tree yielding fruit after its kind, whose seed was in itself. Concerning the animals that live in the water, whales, fish, oysters, crabs, and those that fly, we read, and God said, let the waters swarm with swarms of living creatures, and let the birds fly above the earth in the open expanse of heaven. And God created the great sea monsters and every living creature that moved wherewith the water swarmed after their kind, and every winged bird after its kind, and it was so. Concerning the animals that live on land, we read, and God said, let the earth bring forth living creatures after their kind, cattle and living things and beasts of earth after their kind, and cattle after their kind, and everything that creepeth on the ground after its kind. Think about it. Grasshoppers don't bring forth donkeys. After its kind. The Bible is not a textbook of science in the first chapter of Genesis, however, because it is a matter of the greatest religious importance. The Bible speaks clearly and finally on a matter of biology. After its kind is the statement of a biological principle that no human observation has ever known to fail. The most ancient human records engraved on stone or painted on the walls of caves bear witness to the fact that horses have ever been horses, bears have ever been bears, geese have ever been geese, reindeer have ever been reindeer. The most desperate and subtle efforts of man in modern times have been unable to alter this divine decree. Seed in itself, producing after their kind. So, you see, nature itself, by God's decree, has given a definite limit that is fixed and it appears as a constant law, as that insurmountable barrier. Each type of organism has its own unique structure of DNA and can only specify the production and reproduction of the same kind. But nevertheless, it precludes evolutions of new kinds. There's a tremendous amount of variation that is potential within each kind, individuals, varieties within each kind, but it is always after its kind. The second thing that makes this stand out is whose seed is in itself upon the earth. God is telling us that seed is needed for propagation, and it's in the fruit, whether it's edible or not. Apple trees, pear trees, peach trees, within the fruit. And also, he speaks of upon, or if you will, above the earth, speaking of things that usually hang at some distance above the ground. And although it receives nourishment from the soil, it grows on top of the earth. It doesn't produce fruit within the earth like potatoes. So 3 broad classes of vegetation. They may not coincide with botanical distinctions as science now makes them, but they seem to be general, and they're very appropriate types of divisions as far as man's use of them is concerned, and the lines of demarcation are drawn at creation, and they're just as sharp now as they were then. How many of you who have been here for a good number of years remember dear brother Ed Troop? Okay, there are those here who remember him. We visited with Ed on one occasion, and he had given us some applesauce. I'm not sure that it was our favorite, but that dear brother insisted that he had planted plums, and he got apple trees. I don't want to speak disparagingly of Ed, but he didn't plant plums and get apple trees. If he planted anything, it was apple seeds, and that brought forth his apple trees. You see, those lines of demarcation God has drawn. And in the creation of all vegetation, we see that God is a God of detail. Why take the time to say all the things that he did here? Why be so pointed in differentiating between these 3 types of vegetation that covers everything that covers the earth? Why does he have to spend this much time? And you're saying, why does this preacher have to spend this much time? But he's concerned for every aspect of our lives. Not only what we consider major things, he's concerned about what we consider minor things. I think that's demonstrated in what Paul says in the book of Philippians chapter 4, verse 6, when he says, be careful or anxious for nothing, but in everything. Class, how much is everything? Everything. Be careful for nothing, but in everything, by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known unto God. Does God care about the minor issues of your life as well as the major? He surely does. He's a God of detail. We pass so glibly over details that God puts in his word that are extremely important. And this is important. God utterly refutes the accepted evolutionary system, which has marine animals evolving millions of years before the evolution of fruit trees and other higher plants, Yet they were created by God 2 days before any marine life ever appeared. The last statement of verse 11 is significant. You see it there? The last statement in verse 11, and it was so. It was so. It indicates again the immediacy of the fulfillment of the thing God commanded. God said, as it were, earth, bring forth. And it was so. That's exactly what happened. The earth responded to the voice of God. Full-grown vegetation brought forth at the spoken word of God. And that's the way God does things. Verse 11 records God's spoken commands, and verse 12 records the immediate fulfillment. And the earth brought forth grass, and herb yielding seed after his kind, and the tree yielding fruit whose seed was in itself after his kind. And God saw that it was good. He spoke that vegetation into existence, and God said, oh, it's good. It's good. And he didn't say, it isn't recorded that he saw that it was going to be good. I can't wait for those seeds to germinate. Can't wait for that corn to come up. Can't wait for those trees to grow. No, no, no. It was so. He saw it, and it was good. It was not something that he was waiting for it to happen. As God spoke and looked at that full-grown creation, he was very pleased with what he had brought into existence as he commanded the earth to do so. That's our God. Verse 13 tells us of the conclusion of the work of the third creative day. And the evening and the morning were the third day. Although the unregenerate and unregenerate mind rejects God, God is still on the throne. Don't ever forget that. God is still on the throne, and he is still carrying out his purposes today. The God of creation is the same God that we serve today. He's the same one to whom we come. And you can be personally related to the God of heaven, the one who created everything that we see and enjoy around us. You can be personally related to him. He's not just, oh, God's up there and I'm down here. No, he's with me. He's with you if you are in Christ Jesus. You can receive Christ as Savior and be personally related to him. And I know that that's the reality for many of you who are here, if not all, this very morning. And those who continue to reject him follow a pattern that was set forth in Romans chapter 1, verses 18 through 23. And it contains God's pronouncement on those who refuse to believe in the authenticity of his mighty creative acts. Listen to the words in Romans 1, 18 through 23. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who hold the truth in unrighteousness, because that which may be known of God is manifest in them. For God hath showed it unto them. For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Because that when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, Neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools, and changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like to corruptible man, and to birds, and four-footed beasts, and creeping things. The very things that God had created. Man said, I'm going to worship that. So we have the monkey god, and the sun god, and all kinds of gods, little g, that people worship. And sometimes they worship the God within themselves. I am God. What do evolutionists aim for? I want to close with this, because even though it was written years ago, to me it was like reading the headlines of today. Thousands of American scientists are confirmed scientific socialists, bent on bringing to eventual fruition their ideal of scientific socialism. Communists know that they do not have a chance to make America communist by means of a frontal attack on our ideology, but they also know they have a very good chance of bringing in communism or socialism or Marxism through the back door of state socialism, and that is what they are trying to do. Believing they have won the battle of the mind in intellectual circles because so many have accepted the philosophy of evolution, evolutionists are looking forward to the next step in the evolution of man, the introduction of societal organism. In this book, Evolution and Human Destiny, Fred Kohler says evolution is leading us on to a scientific world state. The individual must always suffer death. For the species as a whole, the race, it would appear probable that a new integration step will take place, leading to the formation of an entirely new organic entity, namely the societal organism. This, he adds, is proceeding at a surprisingly fast pace. And he injects this horrifying thought. The further evolution of human society would be greatly affected by the development of a reproductive system operating on a societal level. An entirely different situation would prevail were it possible to sire future humanity from the best fraction of 1% of the human race. So many of the intellectual readers of our nation are seeking to browbeat and brainwash the common herd into the acceptance of the theories of evolution gelled into the political formula of state socialism, and they are willing to prostitute our rugged individualism, rape the human mind, banish marriage, and force the public into a goose-step mentality that can be led into the totalitarian setup of their predicted societal organism. This eventually will demolish the home and set up a materialistic state based on scientific breeding that will produce a loveless, godless, Christless race, each individual being a mere cog in the state machine, and Huxley's scientific humanism will replace God and Christ. Sound familiar? On the other hand, he speaks, telling of how many have bought into the theory of evolution, which he calls the preposterous theory. On the other hand, scores of noted scientists have witnessed against evolution. Professor Fleischmann, modern zoologist of Esslingen, after repudiating Darwinism, said the Darwinian theory of descent has not a single fact to confirm it in the realm of nature. It is not the result of scientific research, but purely the product of imagination. Such a great thinker as Here's another. The late Sir William Dawson, Canada's great geologist, said of evolution, it is one of the strangest phenomena of humanity. It is utterly destitute of proof. Such a great thinker as Dr. Robert A. Millikan, famous physicist and Nobel Prize winner, said, the pathetic thing is that we have scientists who are trying to prove evolution, which no scientist can ever prove. Dr. Millikan is an evolutionist, but he's honest enough to admit it is a theory that cannot be proved. We are brought back, beloved, to the Scriptures and to the God of Scripture and to the details that God has given us. We read of those who speculate here and speculate there, and it might have been this, and it could be that. We're not sure about this. And God says, just read my word. Just read my word and believe me. And I say again, dear friends, if we cannot trust God in Genesis 1:1 and Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapters 1 through 11, then we cannot trust God anywhere that he purports to speak in the Scriptures. If God is true, if God is not a liar, and that is what the Scriptures tell us, our God is true. He's not a liar. He's not a man that he should lie. And those verses in Genesis 1 have to be taken at face value by faith. Oh, may we cling to that which is true rather than building upon the speculations of men who want to throw God out of the picture. Jonathan, if you would, please.